Gertrude Stein, The Art of Words, The Words of Art. Gertrude Stein's story began on a crisp February day in 1874, when she was born in Allegheny, Pittsburgh, into a family that would soon decide to travel broadly, shifting her childhood across continents and cultures and priming her mind for a life marked by bold curiosity. She was the fifth child of Daniel and Amelia Stein, German Jewish immigrants who sought opportunities in the United States but never lost their taste for the cosmopolitan. From early on, Gertrude was surrounded by intellectual chatter in her home. Her father's interest in business and investment mingled with her mother's careful running of the household, and conversation around the dinner table often drifted toward music, theater, and politics. She was known to stare intently at the grown-ups, absorbing everything, the gestures, the words, the sense that life was always more complicated than it appeared at first glance. When Gertrude was still a small child, the family moved to Vienna and then to Paris, exposing her to the rhythms of European life at a tender age. Although the stay was relatively short, the swirl of a foreign language and the smell of café au lait in the early morning lodged somewhere in her memory. Years later, that half-remembered, half-imagined impression of Paris would become her destiny, but at the time, it was simply a child's wide-eyed wonder. Ultimately, the Steins returned to the United States, settling in Oakland, California. There, Gertrude and her siblings enjoyed a comfortable life, but Gertrude's mind was shaped most significantly by her older brother Leo, whose intellectual capacity and intensity fascinated her. They would remain close for many years, their bond sealed by a shared appetite for knowledge and a certain fearless approach to art, conversation, and self-invention. By the time she entered her teenage years, Gertrude displayed a remarkable aptitude for analysis and a tendency to question orthodoxies. She found high school a pleasant enough sphere in which to shine. She had a flair for writing, a stubborn determination, and a hearty sense of self. College beckoned. She enrolled at Radcliffe College, then the Women's Coordinate College of Harvard University in 1893. There, she came under the influence of the psychologist and philosopher William James, whose ideas on consciousness intrigued her. James recognized Gertrude's unusual brilliance, though he also remarked on her laziness when something failed to spark her curiosity. "Gertrude," he allegedly told her one day after class, "you could be a genius if you would only put your mind to it." Of course, Gertrude loved hearing that she could be a genius. She felt it validated her sense that her intellect was expansive, her thinking style original. After Radcliffe, she enrolled at Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore. She was fascinated by psychology and the workings of the mind, but the more she progressed in her studies, the more she realized that her interests lay elsewhere. A turning point came during her clinical rotations. She was expected to focus intently on the methods of diagnosing the human body, but her mind drifted to the subtle interplay of language among doctors, patients, and nurses, to the structure of conversation, to the unspoken clues of identity that hovered in the air. She soon found herself skipping classes or arriving only to sit in quiet corners and scribble notes on stray bits of paper about how words collided and reformed. Finally, she decided she could not continue. She left medical school without completing her degree, and with that step, her life's trajectory shifted forever. Together with Leo, she moved to Paris in 1903. The siblings secured an apartment on the left bank, settling at 27 Rue de Fleurus, a location that would become mythic in the years to follow. Like many Americans searching for a different energy, a more incandescent intellectual climate, Gertrude found Paris both exotic and surprisingly welcoming. It was a heady time in the city. Avant-garde painters were breaking from academic traditions. Writers haunted cafes, shaping new literary movements. Musicians experimented with tonalities. Everywhere, newness was in the air. Gertrude was determined to be at the heart of it all. It wasn't long before she and Leo discovered the works of Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso, two rising giants who, at that time, were regarded with skepticism by the more traditional art collectors. "We don't quite know what to make of it," murmured a middle-aged French collector at a gallery opening, standing before a violently colored Matisse painting. "It looks more like a savage dream than a proper composition." But Gertrude disagreed. She found Matisse's bold use of color revelatory. She and Leo began collecting art with an enthusiasm that verged on obsession. The walls of their apartment soon displayed works by Cézanne, Renoir, Gauguin, and the newer talents of Matisse, Derain, and Picasso. That small salon, with its swirling smoke from the fireplace in winter and the constant shift of chairs to accommodate visitors, quickly became a gathering place for the avant-garde. Leo and Gertrude were hosts with different energies. Leo was more retiring, content to discuss brushstrokes and the evolution of perspective with painters who were earnest about technique. Gertrude was more flamboyant. She sat in a large armchair or sometimes perched on a stool, wearing her comfortable smock-like dresses, conversing about ideas in an idiosyncratic, elliptical fashion. She had a distinctive voice, low and firm, with an American accent that she never tried to hide. Painters and writers found her mesmerizing. She had a knack for turning an offhand remark into a philosophical pronouncement, and she repeated certain phrases to emphasize them until they seemed to take on the shape of an incantation. Matisse was one of the earliest to frequent her salons. Though older than Picasso, he was still forging his path, recognized for his innovative use of color, but often ridiculed by conservative critics. In Gertrude, he found a champion, someone who delighted in boldness. Late one evening, with only a few stragglers left from the usual Saturday gathering, Matisse showed her sketches for a new composition. The lines were simple and fluid, the color scheme a riot of reds and oranges in his mind. "They will call me crazy again," he said with a half-smile. Gertrude tilted her head, studying the paper. "Let them," she said. "You see something they don't yet see. They'll come around." Matisse reached for his coat, his eyes bright. "I believe you might be right, Gertrude," he replied in heavily accented English. "It is good to have someone who trusts what I do." Picasso, younger, Spanish, and fiercely intense, first came to the Salon in 1905, brought by the American writer and art collector Sarah Stein, who was married to Gertrude and Leo's older brother Michael, or possibly by Matisse. Accounts vary. But whenever he arrived, the story goes that he was shy at first, speaking in soft French or broken English. He was then in his so-called rose period, moving away from the blues that marked his earlier works. Gertrude and Leo acquired a painting from him, impressed by his direction. Over time, a friendship blossomed between Picasso and Gertrude, nurtured by their mutual fascination with new forms of expression, he in paint, she in words. It was not just admiration, it was a sense that each of them was reshaping art at its root. They recognized in one another an unusual kind of genius that courted mockery and even ridicule from the mainstream. Picasso soon began painting Gertrude's portrait, a process that took many months and tested both their patience. He would have her sit for hours. Her image on the canvas changed repeatedly as he wrestled with how to capture her unmistakable solidity, her powerful presence. Once, exasperated, he painted out her entire face. "I can't see you any more when I look," he muttered, palette in hand. Gertrude did not mind. She suspected that the real portrait would be less about the shape of her nose or the curve of her cheek, and more about the essence of her being. Finally, when he declared it finished, the painting showed her with an inscrutable, mask-like face. "But she doesn't look like me," a friend whispered upon first seeing it. Picasso, overhearing, is said to have replied in Spanish-tinged French, "She will." Later in life, indeed, Gertrude's face did come to resemble the portrait's intense gravity. In these years, the Saturday evening salons at 27 Rue de Fleurus became a veritable institution. Writers, artists, dancers, and critics crammed into Gertrude's small drawing room, stepping around stacks of canvases that leaned against walls. Among the regulars were the painters André Derain, Georges Braque, and sometimes Marie Laurencin, who came with Guillaume Apollinaire, the poet. Musicians like Eric Satie might stop by, though not as often. American artists, too, began to appear, curious about this American woman who seemed to embody the spirit of modernism. And soon, a new figure arrived in Gertrude's life who would irrevocably change her personal world: Alice Babette Toklas. Alice B. Toklas came to Paris in 1907 from San Francisco, newly arrived and introduced to Gertrude Stein by a mutual friend. She was of similar background, Jewish from the American West, but with a personality quite unlike Gertrude's. Alice was delicate and careful, a small, slender presence who wore modest dresses and observed with warm, intelligent eyes. The story goes that when she first visited 27 Rue de Fleurus, with the walls ablaze with Fauviche and Cubist canvases, she was immediately drawn to Gertrude, whose magnetism was apparent even in that crowded salon. Gertrude, in her typical direct manner, might have said something like, "You are from California? Well, we'll have to see about that," prompting a soft, uncertain laugh from Alice. Soon, Alice took on the role of friend, confidant, secretary, and then partner. She organized the household, typed up Gertrude's manuscripts, and managed social appointments. Before long, it was clear to all that they were a couple. Though never publicly labeled as such in that era's more discreet climate, the arrangement was impossible to miss. Gertrude was the flamboyant genius, Alice her steady anchor. A friend once teased Alice about always seeming to stand behind Gertrude's chair. "Where else should I stand?" Alice replied gently, implying that her place was precisely there, in quiet support, near the center of Gertrude's world. And so it was. By the 1910s, the circle around Gertrude expanded and contracted in waves. Tensions arose between Matisse and Picasso as each pushed his art in new directions, and Gertrude often found herself in the middle. Leo, too, began to diverge from Gertrude in taste. He disliked some of Picasso's latest experiments, objecting that they veered too far from recognizable form. Gertrude stood by Picasso, enthralled by his fragmentation of perspective. The siblings' disagreements over aesthetics grew heated. Leo accused Gertrude of being seduced by Picasso's rebelliousness. Gertrude retorted that Leo was stuck in the past. Eventually, in 1914, Leo moved away, leaving Gertrude in possession of most of the Picassos, while he took a good deal of the other paintings. The Cézanne, for instance, ended up with him. The break between them was serious, marking the end of their shared artistic adventure. They remained in sporadic contact, but the closeness they had once shared in Oakland and later in Paris never truly returned. Meanwhile, Gertrude was emerging not just as a collector and cultural fixture, but as a writer in her own right. She had been working on manuscripts for years, though her style was so unusual that publishers balked at taking the risk. Her first published book, 3 Lives, 1909, was a set of novellas about 3 working-class women, the good Anna, Melanctha, and the gentle Lena. At first glance, it resembled a simple realist narrative, but on closer inspection, readers noticed the rhythmic, repetitive language, sentences that circled around themselves as if searching for the essence of each character's experience. Critics were perplexed. Some found it mesmerizing, others complained it was too odd, too mannered. But Gertrude didn't budge. She continued to experiment, driven by her conviction that language was malleable and that repetition could peel back layers of meaning to reveal fresh truths. She worked on a mammoth novel, The Making of Americans, from 1903 to 1911, though it would not see full publication until much later. In it, she attempted to map out the genealogies and psychological patterns of an American family, employing an intensely repetitive style that tested even her admirers. "I write for myself and for strangers," she once declared. "Everyone else can catch up if they choose." The warping of grammar, the reconfiguration of syntax, the deliberate refusal to conform to the usual narrative arcs, these became hallmarks of what critics would call her Cubist writing style. As Picasso was fracturing perspective in paint, Gertrude was fracturing perspective in words. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 disrupted life in Paris for many expatriates, but Gertrude and Alice chose to stay. They became involved in relief efforts, driving supplies to hospitals. Gertrude famously secured a permit to drive a Ford truck, though she was a notoriously bad driver, with Alice often riding along, giving instructions and trying to keep them from landing in a ditch. When the war finally ended, Paris reawakened, and a new generation of American expatriates poured into the city, seeking the freedoms and excitement that post-war Europe offered. Among them was Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway came to Gertrude's salon in the early 1920s, introduced by the writer and poet Ezra Pound, or perhaps by Sherwood Anderson. Accounts vary. Either way, Hemingway was a young, ambitious journalist and would-be novelist, newly married to his first wife, Hadley. He admired Stein's writing, or at least was curious about it, and recognized her authority on modern art. Their early encounters had an easy warmth. Hemingway listened wide-eyed as Gertrude recounted anecdotes about Picasso, Matisse, and the war years. She, in turn, saw something raw and brash in Hemingway, an energy she found both invigorating and occasionally abrasive. "You are all a lost generation," she told him, a phrase he would use famously as the epigraph to "The Sun Also Rises." Their friendship led Hemingway to absorb some of Gertrude's writing advice. She insisted on the power of simple, declarative sentences, on the aesthetic effect of repetition, though she also appreciated that Hemingway's style was more stripped down, more direct. "Begin over again and concentrate," Gertrude told him, as he later recalled. He listened to her like she was an oracle, Alice confided to a mutual acquaintance. But for all their camaraderie, tensions eventually arose. Hemingway's star soared quickly after the publication of The Sun Also Rises, 1926, and Gertrude, though proud of his achievement, perceived a certain arrogance in him that grated on her. They had an argument, the details of which remain fuzzy. Perhaps it concerned remarks Hemingway had made about Alice, or some slight about Gertrude's writing. The breach was never fully healed. Hemingway, years later, would portray Stein in unflattering terms in his memoir A Movable Feast, mocking her style and highlighting her supposed insecurities. But for that brief, incandescent period, they were close, forging a path for what modern literature could be. Meanwhile, other writers, F. Scott Fitzgerald, James Joyce, though he and Stein were never quite friendly, Ford Madox Ford, and others, circled in and out of her orbit. Stein became a kind of literary hostess, known for her pronouncements, her quick wit, and her unwavering belief in the new. She once declared, "I am writing for myself and strangers." It became a sort of mantra. And she tested her readers' patience with works like Tender Buttons, 1914, a collection of prose poems that defied conventional sense. With phrases like "a carafe that is a blind glass," or the repeated line "roast potatoes for," she invited readers into a linguistic labyrinth. Some found brilliance there, others found nonsense. Stein pressed on. In the 1920s, she continued to write, but it was the 1930s that brought her mainstream recognition through an unlikely bestseller, The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, 1933. Written in Alice's voice, it recounted their life in Paris, their friendships with artists and writers, and the story of Gertrude's own creative journey. Cleverly adopting the viewpoint of Alice, Gertrude effectively wrote her own autobiography in a style more approachable than her previous experimental works. Readers devoured it. It became a literary sensation, bringing Stein an international fame she had never quite expected. To capitalize on that success and to revisit her homeland, Gertrude embarked on a lecture tour of the United States in 1934 and 1935. She traveled coast to coast, delivering talks at universities, meeting fans, and renewing her sense of identity as an American. Journalists flocked to interview her. She appeared in newspapers and magazines, her rotund figure and broad face instantly recognizable. She commented on American life in her typically offbeat manner, praising certain elements of its energy while dissecting its provincialities. Some Americans found her baffling, but many were charmed by her wit. Alice accompanied her, of course, acting as manager and companion, though the official narrative remained that they were friends. When asked how she liked America, Alice typically gave a polite, measured response. Gertrude, on the other hand, was more direct. "It's wonderful how you are all so certain in your uncertainties," she might remark, causing laughter and confusion in equal measure. In one of her lectures, she explained her writing style. "I create a continuous present. I write as if the past and future do not exist, so that words are always moving, always present." Many listeners scratched their heads, but a few nodded, understanding that she was explaining the essence of her literary experiments in direct, if cryptic, language. After returning to Paris, Gertrude continued to entertain and to write. Her circle had changed. Matisse and Picasso were now famous, each in his separate domain, and their old rivalry had cooled into mutual respect. Hemingway was no longer around the salon, though occasionally they might exchange clipped greetings if they met on the street. Younger writers sought her out, hoping for a blessing or simply to bask in her presence. During the Spanish Civil War and the tensions leading to World War II, Gertrude's interest in politics and social events grew more complicated. She became involved in her own way with certain efforts to maintain peace. Despite controversies later about her political stances, particularly regarding the Vichy regime and her complex ties to Bernard Fay, a French academic with collaborationist leanings, Stein managed to remain in France throughout World War II without severe harm. She and Alice spent most of the war in the countryside, in Billignon, near Belly, aided by friends. In these later years, Gertrude had time to reflect. She wrote memoir-like works, such as Everybody's Autobiography, 1937, and Wars I Have Seen, 1945, the latter recounting her experiences during the Second World War. Her style mellowed slightly, but she never relinquished her experimental edge. She still believed in the power of repetition and the subversion of grammar, though she understood that her name was now far larger than it had once been, and that many readers preferred her more narrative style. She balanced these impulses, writing for a public that had grown to see her as an icon of modernism. Occasionally, she and Alice would receive younger visitors, artists and poets who considered Stein a kind of sage. They'd sit in the living room, a room that looked much the same as it had decades earlier, cluttered with pictures, books, and comfortable chairs. Gertrude would sit, often with a cigarette in hand, though she was never quite the chain smoker that some rumored her to be, and she'd quiz the visitors about their own work. "What are you making?" she might ask a young painter. "I like the sound of making," she'd say, "rather than painting. Don't you?" The painter would nod eagerly, uncertain but excited. Her interactions with Picasso continued until the end. Though they were no longer as close as in the bohemian fervor of pre-war Paris, they maintained a certain bond forged in those early days when each recognized a kindred revolutionary spirit in the other. One story goes that Picasso visited her not long before her death, each greeting the other warmly, two old generals surveying the battlefield of modern art that they had once stormed. They spoke of new painters, new directions in art. Picasso might have said, "They are still learning what we did," to which Gertrude might have replied, "We are all always beginning again, aren't we?" And perhaps they exchanged a wry smile. Hemingway, too, came to mind. Although their friendship had suffered a rift, she still followed his career. "He does write some good sentences," she said to a friend in a moment of guarded admiration. When she learned he had published For Whom the Bell Tolls, she showed a brief flicker of pride to Alice, though she said nothing publicly. It was complicated. She had once been his mentor, but time and ego had intervened. Such was the nature of Gertrude's relationships, intense, fruitful, and sometimes fraught with irreconcilable disagreements. As the war ended and liberation came to France, Gertrude's health began to fail. She was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and by the time it was discovered, it was too advanced for surgical intervention to be of much use. In July 1946, she experienced severe pain and was admitted to the American hospital in Neuilly. There, she faced surgery that offered little hope. Her final words are famously recounted by Alice. As Alice sat by her bedside, distraught, Gertrude asked, "What is the answer?" And receiving no reply, continued, "In that case, what is the question?" She slipped into unconsciousness and died on July 27, 1946. Alice was inconsolable. The woman who had shaped her life for nearly 4 decades was gone, and with her, an epoch ended. The funeral took place in Père Lachaise Cemetery, where many notables of the arts and letters were laid to rest. A handful of mourners, including Picasso, attended, paying their respects to the woman who had recognized genius before it was fashionable to do so. In death, her reputation became more secure, even as controversies lingered about her war years and her sometimes difficult temperament. Yet it is her contribution to literature that endures most powerfully. Modernism in English would have been markedly different without her experiments. She took the language by the shoulders, shook it, and repeated words until they lost their shapes and found new ones. "A rose is a rose is a rose is a rose," she wrote, suggesting that no matter how often you repeat the name of a thing, it remains elusive and newly discovered in each utterance. She forced readers to confront the fluidity of meaning, to see how easily words might become shape and color, how easily they might be fractured and rearranged like the planes of a Cubist portrait. And then there was her role as a cultural catalyst. At 27 Rue de Fleurus, she fostered the careers of Picasso, Matisse, and a long line of aspiring writers. She was an impresario of ideas, drawing people in and challenging them to articulate what was new and important. Without Gertrude Stein's salon, it is possible that the history of modern art and literature would have taken a different course. She provided the stage on which brilliant minds could wrestle with the boundaries of convention, urged them not to retreat from ridicule, and guaranteed that at least one appreciative mind, her own, would understand their radical impulses. The stories of her interactions with Matisse and Picasso are legion. Picasso once laughed about her intense questioning regarding his shift to Cubism. "She asked me so many times, 'And how do you see it now? And how does the eye break it apart?' I didn't know how to explain, so I told her, 'Look harder, look again, and you will see what I see.'" Matisse, for his part, was indebted to her early patronage. They eventually had a cooling of friendship, partly because Stein's loyalties were pulled in so many directions. But to the end of his life, Matisse acknowledged the importance of her support in establishing his early success. She had bought his paintings when others sneered, and her enthusiasm had helped him maintain confidence in his bold palette. Her relationship with Hemingway may have ended poorly, but it was significant while it lasted. Hemingway learned from her the power of the declarative sentence, of paring language down to its essence. She, in turn, recognized in him a new brand of American writer, shaped by the brutality of war and the desires of youth. However fleeting their friendship, it was enough to spark an entire generation's shift in literary style. She reportedly told him, "Write the truest sentence that you know," a piece of advice that became a guiding principle in his quest for unadorned truth. And then there was her life with Alice B. Toklas. Their partnership stands as a quiet testament to love and intellectual companionship. While Gertrude dazzled visitors with her monologues, Alice orchestrated the smaller details, from the cooking of meals, famously weaving in her own experiments, though perhaps not as legendary as her later brownies anecdote that circulated in certain circles, to the preservation of Gertrude's papers. Their private nicknames for each other, Gertrude was Baby Wujums, Alice was Pussy, among others, showed a tenderness that seldom appeared in public view. They accepted their relationship for what it was, at a time when society provided very few models for such an arrangement. It was only later, in the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, that Gertrude teased the world with a glimpse of their day-to-day domesticity, filtered through Alice's persona. In that sense, Gertrude Stein's legacy also includes a quiet, revolutionary statement about the possibilities of love and domestic partnership between two women in an era that offered little public acceptance. Their life together was inseparable from Gertrude's creative output. Alice's unwavering presence allowed Stein the freedom to push her language experiments to the brink. Such was the tapestry of Gertrude Stein's life, an American girl who studied under William James, dabbled in medical school, and found her true calling in Paris. A collector of paintings who saw the genius in Matisse and Picasso before the rest of the world caught on. A writer who dismantled syntax and grammar, forging a new mode of literary expression that confounded many but liberated others. A cultural figure whose salon was the cradle of modernism, a lover and partner to Alice B. Toklas in a union that endured war, fame, and the incessant flow of curious visitors. And finally, an icon whose influence stretched across continents, from Hemingway's minimalist prose to the swirling color fields of post-war art movements. If one imagines a moment near the end, perhaps in 1945, Gertrude seated in an armchair, the war recently ended, the city of Paris stirring with cautious optimism. Alice stands behind her, hands gently resting on the back of the chair. Their apartment is quieter than it once was, but the paintings on the walls still vibrate with daring color. Gertrude's voice, a bit raspier with age, addresses a young poet who has come to pay homage. "Writing," she says slowly, "is not about describing what you see. It is about making others see. But to do that, you must first unsee all the habits of language that blind you." The poet scribbles this down, unsure exactly what it means, but feeling the thrill of being in her presence. That poet would go home and try to puzzle out Stein's words, perhaps penning lines that dance around, meaning rather than chase it head-on. And so, the cycle continues. Because that was Gertrude Stein's gift. She was a catalyst, sparking creative fires in others, demanding that they break through their complacency. Some found it frustrating, others found it revelatory. But no one denied that she changed the terrain of modern art and literature. Her final resting place in Père Lachaise is a humble one, but pilgrims still come, leaving stones on the grave or small notes of gratitude. It is not unusual to find an art student or an aspiring poet standing there, reflecting on how a determined American expatriate, ensconced in a Parisian salon, managed to alter the course of 20th century culture. Perhaps they recall the story of Picasso's portrait or the sentence, Rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, or the saga of the Saturday evenings at Rue de Fleurus. And in that moment they sensed the echo of her voice, steadfast, proud, and delightfully perplexing, reminding them that art is invention, that language is clay to be molded, that identity is a creation always in flux. In the end, Gertrude Stein's life was her art. She lived it as she wrote, with bold repetition of certain truths she found essential, with a radical disregard for rules that did not suit her, and with an abiding belief in the power of the new. Picasso once said that to create, one must destroy the old. Gertrude might have amended that statement. To create, one must first reinvent the language that describes creation. She did so with unwavering audacity, leaving behind a body of work that continues to fascinate, bewilder, and inspire anyone willing to embrace her continuous present, her labyrinth of words, her roving and ever-questioning mind. And all the while, she was there in the salon, greeting visitors with a disarming directness, an American in Paris whose unorthodox brilliance shaped the modern world.